It began, as many Cold War stories did, with a shipment that no one dared to question. In the autumn of 1963, an Aeroflot flight lifted off from Moscow bound for Vienna, its cargo hold filled with diplomatic pouches and sealed cases bearing the double-headed eagle of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Among them was one that looked entirely ordinary, a grey briefcase with a lead lining, tagged Priority Z. It was logged as containing technical documents for the embassy's science attaché. But inside, cushioned in felt and lead foil, lay several small metallic cylinders. They were warm to the touch, faintly humming with invisible energy. The contents were uranium-235. The briefcase traveled freely through customs, escorted by a young Soviet attaché with perfect paperwork and a confident smile. No one could open it, diplomatic immunity forbade inspection. To the guards and handlers, it was just another symbol of Cold War privilege, untouchable, inviolate. Only a few within the KGB's 13th Directorate knew the truth. The Soviet Union had begun moving fissile materials across Europe under the cover of diplomacy, bypassing every layer of Western security. The purpose was never written down. Some said it was for research exchanges with friendly states, others believed it was a covert supply chain for nuclear espionage. In the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Moscow had grown obsessed with closing the scientific gap between East and West. Soviet laboratories needed samples, isotopes, reactor parts, alloy prototypes, materials that could not simply be requested or purchased. So the KGB turned to its most trusted couriers, the diplomats. Men and women who could cross borders unsearched, their luggage invisible to law. It was a solution elegant in design, reckless in consequence. The first hints that something unusual was happening came not from Washington or London, but from Stockholm. Swedish customs officials, calibrating new Geiger counters at Arlanda Airport, detected a faint radiation spike near the diplomatic arrivals terminal. The readings vanished as quickly as they appeared, and no one wanted to provoke an incident with the Soviet embassy. The instruments were blamed, the matter forgotten. But in Western intelligence circles, a whisper began to circulate, the glowing parcels. Anonymous intercepts spoke of couriers carrying reactive cargo, of embassies receiving deliveries that had to be handled with gloves. Inside the Soviet bloc, these operations were managed with military precision. One of the officers overseeing logistics was Major Yuri Lodyanov, stationed in East Berlin. He was known for punctuality and for his almost photographic memory of transport schedules. His task was to supervise the movement of sealed containers between embassies in Prague, Vienna, and Geneva, hubs where East and West touched but never trusted. Lodyanov never asked what he carried. But when a colleague collapsed after handling a mislabeled briefcase, he began to notice the subtle precautions, the lead cases, the air filters, the way superiors avoided touching certain packages with bare hands. For the Kremlin, the stakes were enormous. Every shipment represented a fragment of power, fuel for reactors, data for weapons modeling, leverage in a world defined by atomic parity. But the risk was equally immense. One lost parcel, one contaminated courier, could expose not only the operation but the fragile illusion that diplomacy was separate from espionage. To the outside world, ambassadors and attachés remained symbols of civility. Inside, they were becoming transporters of something far more dangerous than paper. By the mid-1960s, dozens of such transfers had taken place, through airports, embassies, and sealed train cars, all invisible behind the shield of diplomatic immunity. None were intercepted. None were even questioned. Each successful delivery emboldened the KGB further, expanding the network into Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and eventually across the Atlantic. Years later, Western archives would reveal how close the world had come to disaster, how a single courier once left a briefcase unattended in an embassy corridor, its contents hot enough to set off alarms across an entire city block had it been found. But at the time, no one knew. The flights continued. The packages moved. And deep inside the KGB's headquarters on Lubyanka Square, the architects of the operation congratulated themselves on their invisible triumph. What they could not foresee was that one of their own would begin to question the mission, and that his doubts would set in motion a chain of events reaching far beyond the corridors of power, into the radioactive heart of the Cold War itself. Diplomatic immunity was one of civilization's oldest shields. It allowed nations to speak, even in times of war, without fear of arrest or interference. Under the Vienna Convention of 1961, a diplomat's person and possessions were considered inviolable. His briefcase, his car, even his mail could not be searched or detained. For centuries, the rule had been a cornerstone of diplomacy. But in the Cold War, it became something else entirely, the perfect loophole. The KGB understood this better than anyone. They realized that the very system designed to prevent conflict could also conceal it, turning embassies into vaults, consulates into laboratories, and couriers into unwitting smugglers of the nuclear age. To most of the world, diplomatic pouches were a symbol of trust. They carried letters, contracts, or technical papers sealed with wax and ribbon. But to the KGB's 13th Directorate, those seals were keys to a hidden world. The Directorate specialized in special materials, a bureaucratic euphemism for anything radioactive, toxic, or militarily sensitive. With authorization from the highest levels of the Politburo, it began to move controlled nuclear substances under official cover. Tiny vials of plutonium dust, reactor control samples, isotope calibrators, each piece small enough to fit inside a leather briefcase, each capable of setting off a full-scale international crisis if discovered. The system was brilliantly simple. Diplomatic cargo was registered under the Foreign Ministry, not the KGB, and accompanied by officers disguised as scientific attachés. Couriers received diplomatic passports, often in the names of cultural advisors or trade liaisons, and were briefed only on what route to take, never what they carried. Some shipments moved by air, others by sealed diplomatic trains running through East Germany and Czechoslovakia. The cases were marked as restricted correspondence, placed in convoy cars, and received at embassies by staff trained to handle them quickly and discreetly. Every movement was logged, every signature carefully forged to blend into normal traffic. By the mid-1960s, Soviet embassies in cities like Vienna, Geneva, and Helsinki had become nodes in an invisible web of nuclear logistics. Western intelligence agencies suspected that something was happening, but they could not prove it. Radiation scanners at airports were rare, and customs officers lacked the authority to inspect diplomatic baggage. Even when faint traces of contamination appeared, a glowing fingerprint on a customs scanner, a radiation spike near a tarmac, there was nothing anyone could legally do. The packages passed untouched, each one another quiet victory for the KGB's engineers of secrecy. Inside the Soviet apparatus, these operations were justified as a necessity. Moscow's nuclear research centers were hungry for foreign samples, especially those that could reveal Western advances in miniaturized warheads or reactor shielding. Diplomatic immunity made that hunger easier to feed. It was efficiency by law, one defector would later say. The world gave us a shield, and we filled it with uranium. Yet even within the KGB, doubts began to surface. Some officers feared contamination, others feared exposure. The 13th Directorate had no margin for error. A misplaced sample, a leaking container, or an exposed courier could mean scandal on an international scale. But the political pressure was immense. Failure to deliver meant suspicion, and suspicion in the KGB could end a career or a life. So the shipments continued, quietly crossing borders as the rest of the world slept. Western agencies, particularly MI6 and the CIA, began piecing together fragments of evidence, faint radiation signatures, intercepted Soviet cables using phrases like Project Courier and immaterial integrity. In Washington, analysts speculated that the Soviets might be exchanging reactor-grade material with friendly nations such as Czechoslovakia or East Germany. Others feared something darker, that Moscow was distributing components to assemble portable nuclear devices, so-called suitcase bombs. The truth was far more intricate. The KGB was not arming satellites but collecting data, measuring decay rates, testing detection thresholds, and learning how far a radioactive package could travel without notice. Every courier became part of a live experiment in espionage physics. By 1965, the KGB's operation had outgrown the corridors of the Foreign Ministry and taken root across an entire continent. What began as a handful of controlled transfers had evolved into a network spanning embassies, consulates, trade missions, and research centers, all linked by couriers moving through Europe's arteries with quiet precision. To an untrained eye, it was diplomacy in motion, black sedans gliding between capitals, attachés shaking hands at airports, crates labeled cultural materials or archival equipment. To those inside the operation, it was a system of power disguised as protocol, carrying within it the lifeblood of the Soviet nuclear program. The heart of the network lay in East Berlin, where the wall divided not only a city but the very intelligent structures of the world. Here, the KGB maintained an office masquerading as a cultural liaison bureau inside the Soviet embassy on Unter den Linden. Beneath its polished floors, a secure basement had been converted into a staging area for special consignments. Packages arrived under diplomatic convoy from Moscow, were inspected by technicians in protective gloves, and then distributed to satellite states. Some went south toward Prague, others west through Vienna, and a few continued by rail into Switzerland. The system ran on schedules tighter than most military operations, with couriers trained to memorize routes instead of carrying maps. Each courier followed the same discipline: arrive, deliver, disappear. They stayed in state-run hotels, spoke little, and avoided any routine that could be tracked. Most were mid-ranking officers from the KGB's scientific directorates, chosen for their education and obedient rather than their field craft. They were bureaucrats in suits, carrying within their briefcases the very substance that kept the nuclear balance alive. To them, it was duty. To the KGB, it was control. The West, however, was beginning to notice patterns that could no longer be ignored. At Vienna's Schwechat airport, radiation monitors used by a health inspection unit twice recorded anomalous readings from the diplomatic arrivals hall, both times corresponding to Soviet flights. In Geneva, a customs inspector reported the strange metallic odor of ozone near the Soviet delegation's baggage area. None of these findings could be acted upon. Diplomatic immunity rendered every observation moot. Still, they accumulated like dust in the archives of Western intelligence. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence opened a small file marked amber light, a code name referencing the faint amber glow emitted by radioactive decay. Analysts cross-referenced travel records of Soviet attachés and found a curious overlap, identical names appearing in Moscow, Berlin, and Geneva within days of each other, all traveling under the same diplomatic status. The agency could not intercept the cargo, but it could watch the men who carried it. That quiet surveillance began in 1966, and it would soon expose the scale of Moscow's ambition. Meanwhile, within the Soviet bloc, coordination fell to a secret logistics office inside the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the ministry responsible for nuclear technology. Its officials worked in silence, drawing up manifests disguised as trade shipments. Uranium samples were declared as geological specimens, isotopes labeled as calibration equipment. To reduce suspicion, every consignment included a few harmless objects, reels of magnetic tape, sealed envelopes, or pieces of glassware, to mimic ordinary diplomatic traffic. In Prague, Czechoslovakia's intelligence service, the STB, maintained a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city where several of these consignments were briefly stored before forwarding. Workers there joked grimly about the metal ghosts that hummed behind the lead doors. When the lights dimmed, Geiger counters in the corner cabinet sometimes ticked softly in the night. They were instructed never to speak of it. Through this network, the KGB gained what it most desired: access. Western reactor blueprints copied in Switzerland, smuggled samples from decommissioned power plants in France, and rare isotopes acquired through front companies in Sweden all flowed eastward under the same protection: diplomatic immunity. It was the perfect crime because it was not illegal, at least not on paper. But every system, no matter how disciplined, eventually reveals its weakness. In the spring of 1967, one courier miscalculated. His train from Vienna to Prague was delayed by heavy rain, forcing him to stay overnight in Brno with the case locked in his hotel room. The next morning, he found the lining of the briefcase scorched and one of the vials cracked, releasing trace contamination into the air. The courier, terrified of reporting the mishap, sealed the case and continued to his destination. Within days, he fell gravely ill. The embassy doctor diagnosed radiation sickness but was ordered to list the cause as influenza. The incident was buried, but Western sensors soon detected a spike in airborne particles drifting over Czechoslovakia, a ghostly fingerprint of the network that no one yet understood. The men chosen to carry the Soviet Union's most dangerous cargo did not see themselves as spies. They were engineers, physicists, and attachés, specialists wrapped in the decorum of diplomacy, trusted with missions whose true nature they could never fully question. Within the KGB's 13th Directorate, they were known simply as couriers atoma, the couriers of the atom. Each was handpicked for discretion, discipline, and loyalty. Their faces rarely appeared in photographs, their names omitted from official rosters. To the outside world, they were ordinary bureaucrats moving from one embassy to another, only their briefcases knew what they truly carried. Yuri Lodyanov had been one of the first. His early career in East Berlin was unremarkable, managing inventories, coordinating shipments, and filing reports to Moscow that vanished into classified archives. But as the operation expanded, so did his responsibilities. In late 1967, he was reassigned to oversee an air corridor between Prague and Vienna, a delicate route used to transfer small vials of reactor-grade uranium and beryllium shielding. The shipments, logged as technical documentation, required absolute punctuality. Every step of the process, from airport transfer to embassy delivery, was timed to the minute. One misstep could draw attention, one delay could break the illusion of normalcy. Each courier operated under a strict set of protocols. They were never to open or question the contents of their packages. They carried two documents at all times, a diplomatic passport and a letter from the Foreign Ministry citing the Vienna Convention. Should customs officials inquire, they were to remain calm, cite international law, and request immediate contact with their ambassador. Under no circumstance were they to surrender their luggage. The aura of authority was their armor, the briefcase, their shield. Inside the Lubyanka headquarters in Moscow, a small administrative cell kept meticulous records of every courier and their cargo. Routes were coded with neutral names: route amber, route iron, route birch. Only the last digits, often appended with Greek letters, revealed the true category of material being transported. The documents were locked in lead-lined safes, accessible only to senior officers of the directorate. For them, the couriers were pawns in a global chess game, each movement calculated not for money or ideology, but for the slow, silent accumulation of nuclear advantage. Lodyanov began to notice things others ignored. The briefcases were heavier than before, the seals thicker. Once, after a flight to Geneva, he saw a technician in the embassy basement wearing gloves and a respirator as he opened a newly arrived case. The man worked quickly, transferring the small metal capsules into another container marked with the insignia of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. When Lodyanov asked what was inside, the technician smiled thinly and said, "Samples. Nothing you need to worry about." Yet the air smelled faintly metallic, and for days afterward, Lodyanov's fingertips burned as if from frostbite. By 1968, the couriers had established predictable rhythms, and Western intelligence began to exploit them. The CIA's Amber Light program coordinated with Britain's MI6 and West Germany's BND to monitor suspected couriers in transit. Surveillance teams tailed Soviet attachés through airports and train stations, photographing their interactions and luggage. Small portable Geiger counters were hidden inside briefcases carried by undercover agents positioned near diplomatic check-in counters. The readings were inconsistent, too faint for certainty, but strong enough to sustain suspicion. It was during one of these operations that a British field officer at Heathrow noticed something remarkable. A Soviet attaché arriving from Prague checked in a single piece of luggage marked as diplomatic cargo. When the case passed through the loading bay, a handheld radiation monitor briefly flickered, then died. The equipment was removed for inspection, and the courier left without incident. 2 weeks later, the monitor was tested in a laboratory, its sensors found to be fused by exposure to an intense but localized source of radiation. It was the first tangible evidence that the rumors were true. Inside Langley, the discovery triggered alarm. Analysts debated the purpose of such shipments. Some feared the Soviets were distributing bomb components to friendly regimes. Others believed the KGB was testing Western detection systems. A smaller faction proposed an even stranger theory, that the USSR was attempting to establish covert caches of nuclear material across Europe, to be retrieved in case of war. Whatever the truth, the evidence was undeniable: radioactive cargo was moving under the cover of diplomacy. Back in Moscow, Lodyanov's unease turned to dread. He had begun coughing constantly, his nails growing brittle. The embassy doctor dismissed it as stress, but the Mirror told another story. Late at night, he wrote to his wife that he sometimes dreamed of glowing suitcases lined up in endless corridors, humming like bees behind walls of iron and glass. He asked for a transfer. The request was denied. By 1969, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Radiation detectors installed at airports across Western Europe were beginning to whisper the same quiet warning, faint but unmistakable spikes each time a Soviet diplomatic flight landed. At first, the readings were written off as coincidence, perhaps the result of medical isotopes or industrial sensors. But when the same anomaly appeared in 3 cities within a single week, Vienna, Copenhagen, and Frankfurt, intelligence agencies realized they were looking at something deliberate. The question was not if the Soviets were moving nuclear material, but how they were doing it without ever being stopped. The diplomatic rules that had protected civilization since the Napoleonic era were now the very barriers preventing action. Customs officers could not inspect sealed pouches, law enforcement could not detain couriers. Every piece of evidence gathered by Western intelligence was circumstantial: a blurred photograph of a briefcase, a faint radiation reading, a courier's unexplained illness. Yet behind those fragments lay a terrifying possibility that Moscow had turned the world's embassies into a global distribution network for atomic contraband. The CIA's Amber Light project expanded rapidly. Analysts at Langley began tracking the schedules of Aeroflot and diplomatic charter flights, cross-referencing them with embassy deliveries and unexplained health incidents. The British, with their usual discretion, took the lead in surveillance. MI6 deployed a small task group nicknamed Radiant Fox, stationed in West Berlin and tasked with observing all Soviet courier movements through Checkpoint Charlie. From rented apartments and parked vans, agents watched convoys pass in the night, polished ZIL limousines and GAZ Volgas gliding across the border under the indifferent gaze of the guards. One of those agents, a former Royal Engineer named Peter Havers, later recalled the unease of watching men who might be carrying something deadly without ever knowing it. "They walked past us like ghosts," he wrote in his report. "We could feel the danger, but we couldn't touch it. The law itself was their shield." Havers and his team recorded hours of film, noting how couriers moved in pairs, how they always handled their luggage personally, and how embassy drivers waited with engines idling as if time itself were classified. Across the Atlantic, Washington debated how far it could push without triggering an international incident. The State Department warned that any breach of diplomatic immunity could collapse the very foundation of global relations. The Pentagon disagreed. The Joint Chiefs argued that the KGB's use of embassies as smuggling channels was, in effect, an act of undeclared war. Somewhere between those opposing views, President Nixon authorized quiet observation but forbade confrontation. The couriers would continue to move, for now. Inside Moscow, the KGB sensed that Western pressure was tightening. The 13th Directorate convened in the Lubyanka subterranean conference room to review procedures. Radiation shielding was increased, couriers were rotated more frequently, and shipments were rerouted through smaller airports in neutral countries. Officially, the operation remained compartmentalized. Even Soviet diplomats stationed abroad often had no idea that their sealed pouches contained radioactive material. But the paranoia was spreading. When one attaché in Helsinki noticed scorch marks on a case's metal clasp, he quietly requested reassignment to the Ministry of Fisheries. His replacement did not ask why. Yuri Lodyanov, still stationed in Vienna, began noticing new faces in the embassy, security men with blank expressions and military posture. The atmosphere had changed. Briefings grew shorter, signatures tighter, questions unwelcome. Once, while waiting in the consulate loading bay, Lodyanov overheard two superiors whispering about contamination levels and the Swedish incident. He understood enough to realize that something had gone wrong, perhaps disastrously so. Then, in early 1970, an unmarked envelope arrived at the British Embassy in Bonn. Inside were 3 photographs and a note written in shaky Russian: "They are carrying death in their hands." The pictures showed Soviet attachés unloading crates from a diplomatic car in the courtyard of the Vienna embassy. One of the crates bore a serial code matching equipment used by the Ministry of Media Machine Building. Intelligence analysts identified the handwriting as possibly belonging to a disillusioned courier, perhaps even someone inside Lodyanov's unit. For the first time, the KGB's invisible network had a human crack in it. It happened quietly, without gunfire or pursuit, as most acts of treason do. On a rain-slick evening in March 1971, Yuri Lodyanov stepped off a tram near Vienna's Stadtpark, walked 3 blocks past the gilded facades of the Ringstrasse, and entered a small cafe that smelled of tobacco and damp wool. He ordered black coffee, sat by the window, and waited. In his briefcase were 2 sets of documents, one bearing the emblem of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the other a sheaf of handwritten notes describing in careful, almost scientific detail, how the KGB was using diplomatic immunity to smuggle radioactive materials across Europe. Lodyanov had spent months preparing for this moment. He knew that the KGB was tightening its grip, couriers vanishing without explanation, foreign embassies quietly observing them, the constant dread of contamination. The system he once served with pride had become, in his mind, a machine feeding on secrecy and fear. His decision to defect was not born of ideology but survival. He was sick, exhausted, and haunted by guilt. The metallic taste in his mouth would not fade, his hands trembled from what doctors called nerve strain. He suspected radiation poisoning but dared not ask. His contact arrived late, a middle-aged man in a brown overcoat, introducing himself simply as Miller. He spoke little Russian but enough to communicate. The 2 men exchanged phrases rehearsed over weeks through intermediaries. When Lodyanov slid the notes across the table, Miller glanced briefly at the pages, folded them into a newspaper, and said only, "We can protect you." That night, Lodyanov vanished from Soviet territory. By morning, his absence was reported to the embassy as a medical emergency. By noon, the KGB had issued an order for his retrieval by any means necessary. Western intelligence understood the magnitude of what they had gained. Within hours, Lodyanov was flown under an assumed name to a safe house near Zurich. There, over the course of 10 days, he recounted everything: dates, names, routes, code names, even the serial numbers of the lead cases he had handled. His testimony was astonishing in its precision. He described how each shipment originated from a warehouse outside Moscow's Mytishki district, how they were logged under the innocuous designation Research Materials 14 Delta, and how diplomatic convoys distributed them through a chain of embassies stretching from Warsaw to Rome. For the first time, the West could see the full architecture of the KGB's smuggling network, a lattice of legal immunity and invisible danger. CIA analysts cross-referenced his account with Amberlight's existing data and found perfect alignment. The Vienna-Prague-Geneva corridor that had puzzled them for years now made complete sense. It was the artery through which the Soviet Union fed its atomic ambitions. But Lodyanov brought more than operational knowledge. He carried evidence, microfilm images of shipping manifests, radiation logs, and one photograph showing a technician in a protective mask handling what appeared to be a glowing metal cylinder. The film was grainy, almost spectral, but enough to make the skin crawl. When presented to the State Department, the material was classified top secret, eyes only. Few within the government ever saw it. Inside the Kremlin, panic replaced discipline. The 13th Directorate's chief, General Viktor Shlyapin, convened an emergency committee at Lubyanka to assess the damage. Every courier was recalled, every foreign post ordered to tighten internal security. Dozens of officers were interrogated, several disappeared entirely. The diplomatic shipments were temporarily suspended, then quietly resumed under a new designation, Project Vektor. To the outside world, nothing changed. Embassies still exchanged parcels, attachés still smiled at receptions, but inside the KGB, a manhunt had begun. Lodyanov's defection was officially denied by Moscow. The Soviet press reported that he had died in a car accident near the Hungarian border, a convenient fiction for public consumption. In reality, he was resettled under a new identity in Canada, working quietly as a translator for an energy research firm. Those who handled his debriefs described him as calm but haunted, prone to silence when the subject turned to his past. He lived with the knowledge that men he once called comrades had likely been executed because of him. For Western intelligence, the defection was both triumph and burden. They had proof of the Soviet operation, yet no legal recourse to stop it. To expose the scheme publicly would risk unraveling the fragile framework of diplomatic law that held the world together. And so, the information was buried within classified vaults, its implications discussed only in secure rooms far from public scrutiny. Still, the revelation forced a subtle shift in the balance of espionage. Airports and border posts began quietly installing radiation monitors disguised as air quality sensors. Western embassies re-examined their own courier procedures. For the first time, the myth of untouchable diplomacy had been pierced. And in the shadows of Moscow, as the KGB purged its own ranks, an unspoken truth settled like dust over Lubyanka's corridors. The most dangerous leak was not an intercepted message or stolen codebook, but a man who simply decided he had seen enough. The Kremlin called it Project Vektor, a sterile name chosen to mask the panic beneath. In the months following Yuri Loginov's defection, the KGB scrambled to rebuild the shattered framework of its covert supply network. The 13th Directorate could not simply abandon its work. Moscow's nuclear programs depended on the flow of materials and information that couriers had once carried without question. Yet now, every suitcase felt like a potential trap, every customs hall a possible ambush. Trust, the rarest commodity in the Soviet system, had evaporated overnight. General Viktor Shlyapin, the hard-faced chief of the Directorate, convened an emergency task force inside the Lubyanka's lower levels. Around the table sat men whose entire careers had been spent hiding behind the facade of diplomacy. Some wanted to suspend all foreign transfers. Others argued that retreat would confirm guilt and invite Western exploitation. Shlyapin made the decision for them. The operation would continue, but under new parameters, smaller shipments, new couriers, tighter compartmentalization. The name Vektor was chosen to suggest control, precision, and inevitability. Its purpose was the same as before, to move fissile samples, microfilms, and research fragments under diplomatic protection. Only the methods would change. The first priority was to identify the mole's full impact. Over 24 couriers were recalled from abroad, interrogated for days in isolation. None admitted to knowing Loginov's intentions, though several hinted that he had grown distant and increasingly cautious. Files were shredded, routes redrawn. Embassies in Vienna, Geneva, and Prague, once the arteries of the network, were placed under internal surveillance. Moscow feared that the CIA might have already planted informants or listening devices. In the culture of the KGB, suspicion was oxygen. Even those who had done nothing wrong could suffocate in it. Meanwhile, inside Western Europe, intelligence services braced for retaliation. MI6 and the CIA expected that the Soviets would attempt to mislead them, perhaps by feeding false signals or decoy couriers. They were right. Within weeks, Soviet diplomats began making conspicuous trips through monitored checkpoints, carrying harmless sealed cases filled with lead weights or simple mechanical parts. Geiger counters stayed silent. It was a bluff, a way to test whether Western agencies were still watching. They were. But beneath the misdirection, Vektor evolved into something more dangerous. Shlyapin authorized a new delivery method that eliminated couriers entirely. Instead of personal luggage, the Directorate began embedding small lead canisters within diplomatic cargo containers shipped between embassies. Each was hidden inside electronic equipment, film reels, or art crates destined for cultural exhibitions. The shipments moved in bulk, impossible to isolate without dismantling the entire container. Once received, embassy technicians, trained in secret, would extract the canisters and forward their contents through other channels. It was a system designed to be untraceable, and for a time, it worked. In Geneva, the Soviet mission's basement became a nerve center for these operations. Beneath the formal meeting rooms where diplomats discussed trade and disarmament, technicians handled radioactive materials under the hum of ventilation fans. To those who knew, it felt like irony made flesh. The same building that hosted peace conferences now served as a waypoint for contraband uranium. By late 1972, Vektor was fully operational. Couriers were still used sparingly, but their routes had shifted toward the Middle East and Africa, where Soviet influence was expanding. Some shipments were rumored to reach Cairo and Tripoli, others to Baghdad. Western analysts debated whether these transfers were scientific aid or clandestine weapon support. The truth was likely both. The Soviet Union was exporting not bombs, but capability, the technical DNA of the nuclear age. Within the KGB, paranoia metastasized into ritual. Each courier underwent radiation checks before and after missions. Briefings were delivered orally, documents burned immediately after reading. Even the lead containers carried inside the pouches were now double-sealed, stamped not with ministry emblems but random serial codes. The bureaucracy of secrecy had become its own religion, worshipping control while fearing contamination. And yet, even the most fortified systems cannot escape human error. In December 1972, a cargo plane bound for Damascus crashed near the Black Sea coast. Among the wreckage recovered by local rescue teams were fragments of lead-lined cases bearing diplomatic seals. Soviet recovery units arrived within hours, confiscating every piece of debris. Officially, the cause was listed as mechanical failure. Unofficially, one technician later confessed that the recovered containers registered dangerously high radiation levels. The incident was erased from the record, but whispers of it reached Western ears months later. By the mid-1970s, the world believed it was entering a calmer age. The headline spoke of détente, of summits in Helsinki, of arms limitation treaties promising a future free from fear. Yet beneath the speeches and handshakes, the machinery of secrecy continued to hum. The KGB's Project Vektor had survived exposure, restructured and buried deeper, feeding on the complacency of an exhausted world. The Cold War had merely changed its costume, less visible, more technical, and infinitely more deceptive. In the vaults of the CIA and MI6, the documents provided by Yuri Lodyanov remained locked behind multiple security classifications. Only a handful of analysts were permitted to study them, and even fewer were willing to believe that such audacious exploitation of diplomatic law could have lasted for over a decade. The files told a simple story written in bureaucratic code, numbers, flight manifests, seal authorizations, but when read together they described an empire of invisible radiation moving silently through the arteries of international relations. It was a portrait of power that depended not on weapons, but on the illusion of trust. Western agencies increased their vigilance. Portable radiation scanners appeared in airports disguised as air quality monitors. Diplomatic cargo was quietly tracked by satellite. Yet politics demanded discretion. To accuse the Soviet Union openly would have jeopardized every treaty and negotiation painstakingly built since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, the truth was contained, classified, redacted, and forgotten by design. Inside the Kremlin, Vektor persisted under new leadership. General Shlyapin retired in 1974, replaced by younger officers schooled in both espionage and nuclear engineering. Their task was no longer acquisition alone, but preservation, maintaining access to isotopes, reactor components, and data networks in the West without drawing suspicion. Some shipments shifted toward Asia, hidden among scientific exchanges with India and Vietnam. Others continued across Europe under the banner of cultural cooperation. The operation had adapted, evolving like radiation itself, invisible, odorless, lethal only when mishandled. But even the most secretive systems leave traces. In 1975, a minor scandal erupted in Sweden when customs officials discovered a radiation leak at a Stockholm storage facility leased to a Soviet trade delegation. The incident was quietly resolved through diplomatic channels, the Soviet ambassador insisting the material was part of a medical isotope experiment. Western analysts recognized the signature immediately. The faint isotopic fingerprint matched samples once described in Loginov's notes. Vektor was still alive, still moving. For Yuri Loginov, life in exile was a quieter form of imprisonment. He lived under a false name in suburban Toronto, his body weakened by illness and his nights haunted by the memories of sealed rooms and metallic air. Occasionally he met with intelligence officers who wanted one more clarification, one more map, but his answers grew vaguer as time passed. In the spring of 1977 he was found dead in his apartment, the cause listed as cardiac failure. There was no autopsy. His file was closed, marked no further relevance. History rarely records the small deaths behind great secrets. The couriers who carried the uranium, the technicians who packed it, the officers who signed the orders, all disappeared into the grey fog of bureaucracy. Yet the echoes of their work lingered. The radiation traces logged at airports, the unexplained illnesses of embassy staff, the occasional disappearance of a diplomat whose name never reached the news, they formed the afterglow of a story too dangerous to tell in its own time. By the 1980s, as new crises replaced old ones, Vektor faded into the margins of classified history. The Soviet Union would collapse 2 decades later, leaving behind archives so incomplete that even modern researchers struggle to separate myth from method. What remained was a single truth whispered among historians of espionage. During the height of the Cold War, the most powerful nation on earth had turned the sacred instrument of peace, the diplomat seal, into a weapon of concealment. The world never learned how many shipments there were, or how much nuclear material changed hands. Perhaps it was minimal, perhaps catastrophic. But the real danger was not the uranium itself, it was the precedent, the proof that any law, no matter how noble, could be twisted until it protected the very thing it was meant to prevent. Today, the files of Project Vektor rest in forgotten drawers, their pages yellowing in silence. The men who built the network are gone, the embassies renovated, the briefcases recycled. Yet somewhere, in the quiet hum of an archive or the flicker of a Geiger counter stored away in a museum basement, a trace of that era still lingers, a reminder that diplomacy and danger once traveled side by side, indistinguishable beneath the same red wax seal. History closes its books, but radiation has no calendar. It simply waits.